that is joining us today for this first debate on the carbon pricing. It's a partnership of Instituto Clima e Sociedade and the Chamber of Commerce, organized by the Convergência pelo Brasil. And today we have a very special set of speakers. We have the former minister Joaquim Levy. We also have Stefano de Clara, who is the director of international policy for IETA, and we have Gustavo Pimentel from Investors for Climate, the Brazilian engagement initiative for investors looking for decarbonization of their portfolios. And to lead us in this session, I'd like to invite the director of ICC in Brazil, Gabriella Dorlhiac. So I hope everyone have a very good morning, and we have a very good debate on this very special issue. Gabriella, please.
Thank you, Gustavo. Good morning, all. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all this morning, especially to talk about such an important issue. As Gustavo mentioned, we'll be here. It's going to be a series of events. This is a partnership between Instituto Clima e Sociedade with the Convergência movement and ICC to discuss low carbon economy and how Brazil can move forward in this important direction. I think when we discuss trade today, when we discuss the economy, when we discuss the private sector, it's not enough for us to discuss just the economic side of trade. For example, is not only about the volume of transactions or the price, but much more. It needs to be about the quality of the transaction. Processes and operations need to be inclusive. They need to be transparent and ethical, and they certainly need to be sustainable. And this is something that we have learned a long time ago at the ICC. It is fully integrated in our mission, as it is with Instituto Clima e Sociedade. For us, there is no business without good sustainable practices. Progress in the environment and not a zero-sum game. And we think this is such an important mentality change that needs to happen. If we look, for example, of the potential, economic potential in carbon markets, if we look about how companies can create competitive advantages when they have sustainable products or sustainable practices, the progress that this can bring to Brazil is immense. And I think, and I wanted to take a minute to talk about, as we have Minister Levy here, the sustainable discussion has become more than just a niche discussion. I think it's a discussion that we need to have broadly in every country and certainly in Brazil. And I think the Convergência initiative, which brought together former ministers and presidents of Brazilian Central Bank from all sides of the political spectrum, is really a historic moment. It wasn't a question of political ideology. It's a question of what country we want to be. And I think the message is very clear. Brazil needs to be a leading voice for sustainability. So truly, it's a pleasure to be moderating the first panel for a practical agenda for green recovery. Today, specifically, we will discuss carbon pricing and risks for Brazil in the transition to a low carbon economy. Before we begin, I just wanted to encourage all viewers to submit questions. A gente gostaria de pedir que todos que estão nos assistindo.
We would like to encourage everybody to send questions through the chat box. They can be in English or in Portuguese.
Levy, who was finance minister for Brazil. Stefano de Clara, from the international policy, who is international policy director for for the International Emissions Trading Association, and Gustavo Pimentel, who is Director for SITAWI. So I wanted to open the discussion and ask each of you, perhaps Minister Levy, starting with you, low carbon economy. What are the main things that you feel are key for the discussions today? What, from a private sector point of view, which you have, and also from a governmental point of view?
Good morning. I think that the first thing that we have to consider about the low carbon economy is how well positioned Brazil is to achieve that. Actually, Brazil is today one of the economies with the smallest carbon footprint in the world. If you think our industrial sector, for instance, 60% of its energy, and energy is a key factor in terms of carbon emissions. Our our industrial sector has 60%, close to 60% of its energy coming from renewable sources. Some linked to a nature-based solution, you could call it, like biofuels. Others from more recent technologies like solar or wind, which are increasing share of the energy in Brazil, in addition to the traditional hydropower. Now, as in so many other sectors in Brazil, aspects of our life and our society, we do have a dual aspect there, a dual economy. So we have these, say, very advanced part of the economy in the industrial sector, even part of transportation. And then we have, of course, all the challenges related to the deforestation, which respond to more emission than actually most of our GDP. So I think we have to address that and understand that actually we are, you better take advantage of our comparative, say, value and the fact that comparing with most countries, we're doing well, and address what is dragging us in terms of emission and with all the other, of course, consequences that we know are related to climate change. So just a start, I think there are so many opportunities in terms not only in Brazil to continue to reduce the carbon footprint in our activities, ranging from transportation, say electricity, and the whole industry, as well as what you can do in terms of trade of say the carbon, the mitigation, say activities that we have here. So we can also help other countries while enhancing our NDCs, our national determined contributions in the framework of the Paris Club. It's a question of organizing our efforts, of having full awareness of our potential and build partnerships.
Thank you, Minister. Gustavo, what's the perspective from the financial sector, from the investors?
Thank you, ICC and X, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. If we think about the financial sector in Brazil, we can look at this fauna and split in different types or segments. If we talk about the banking sector, the banks, I would say they are more aware of climate change and therefore about the potential for carbon pricing, both in international markets and in the domestic markets for quite a long time. But then if you look at the investment sector, and then we could include here the pension funds, wealth managers and asset managers, the reality is actually quite different. They've kind of woke up for the topic like some 2 or 3 years ago as a sector, as a segment. And actually, as in our experience working with this different parts of the financial sector, is that on the investment sector, you actually had to do some basic awareness, explaining climate change and showing them it had anthropogenic causes, because it would even be questioned by local investors whether climate change was anthropogenic or not, let alone discuss policy issues like carbon pricing. So I've caught myself in many meetings with investors explaining the difference between carbon and greenhouse gas, and all these intricacies of this complex topic that we work with, of course. But this has been changing quite fast, and I think that what's happening in international markets and this movement around ESG, environmental social governance in general, this is also bringing the climate awareness from the financial sector and investor standpoint. And because Brazil is not an island, well, at least not yet. So local investors are becoming more aware of all of these topics. But still, when we talk about with investors discussing what they should do about carbon pricing, how they should look at their portfolios, whether they should decarbonize their portfolios, or whether they should investigate how climate risk can pose a risk to portfolios, then we have to start from the basics. And we have one specific challenge here in Brazil, which is mostly the investment sector is quite domestic. I mean, if worldwide we say there's a domestic bias in portfolios, in Brazil that's extremely acute, and investors are pretty much 95% or even more of their portfolio allocations are in the domestic market. And therefore we create this challenge, and picking up on Joaquim's point, in which the sectors that we have, which are carbon intensive, it's mostly about land use and land use change, right? This is where the bulk of our emissions are. And if you want to decarbonize, you have to find a solution for this. Whereas if you look at where investors are actually invested, they are in the real economy, and they're usually not so related directly to land use or land use change. They might invest in some companies in the value chain, but they are not investing in the companies that are directly deforesting. So usually they're investing in a company listed in the stock exchange or that issues bonds, and perhaps these companies will have first-tier suppliers, second-tier suppliers, or even clients that are perhaps causing some deforestation and therefore carbon emissions. So this is a challenge that can vary quite significantly from your benchmarks. So this is an additional challenge that we have here, and that we hear from investors all the time. Having said that, and perhaps to conclude this opening, investors are included as a policy dialogue, as a policy measure that could actually help them decarbonize. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. And certainly, I think there's a lot still to unpack when we talk about the financial sector and what incentives they see, and what still are the challenges in convincing them to fully embrace this. Stefano, over to you. And I think you bring a very important perspective, which is the international perspective. So perhaps give us an overview of what's happening in other countries and how Brazil fits into this.
Thanks. And so first of all, obviously, thank you for the invite to be here today with you and to discuss these topics. I really want to build for a few minutes on a couple of Gustavo's comments, because I think they were spot on, and I think especially I want to build on what he said about Brazil not being an island, which is important, and a couple of remarks about carbon pricing, because I think it's important to look at what's happening in the carbon pricing space at the international level and in other countries and regions. And if possible, there is just one single slide I want to show while I speak. And of course, the starting point for the whole discussion and what we need to keep in mind when we consider carbon pricing at the higher level is, of course, the Paris Agreement and the commitments that different countries are putting forward under the Paris Agreement. And we should also keep in mind that these commitments will start in a few months from now. The official start date will be January 2021. And under the Paris Agreement, all countries will have targets for 2025, 2030, and beyond. And these are targets that they decide to take themselves. I mean, this is just the nature of the Paris Agreement. And what's interesting to consider is what different countries are doing back home at the domestic level to translate those targets and commitments into policies that can deliver those emission reduction goals. And one of the most popular and widespread policy tool to reduce carbon emissions is carbon pricing, which is what we are talking about today. And more specifically, when it gets to implement carbon pricing, countries have two main choices. They can either implement a carbon tax or an emission trading system, which is also often called a carbon market. And this is what you have on this map, which comes from a World Bank report that gets published every year and provides a recap of the state and trends in global carbon pricing. And basically, carbon taxes and emission trading systems are just two different ways of generating a price on CO2 emissions. And they work in two almost opposite ways. So if you have a carbon tax, you decide a price that emitters have to pay for emitting CO2, and you basically decide which sectors you want to have covered by that price. And as a result, you can get an emission reduction outcome. Instead, an emission trading system works in the other way around. So again, you decide which sectors you want to cover. You decide what your environmental outcome should be, and then the emission trading system generates a price as a result of that, and as a result of the cap you're putting on emissions. And as you can see on this map, there's no single answer to the question of which form of carbon pricing is better. Different countries are implementing different systems, and there are no two identical emission trading systems, and there are no two identical carbon taxes around the world, because they can be designed in different ways, they can be implemented in different ways, and they can also achieve slightly different outcomes. And different forms of carbon pricings have been around for decades. I mean, the first carbon taxes date back to the 1990s. The first large emission trading system was established 15 years ago in Europe, and you will see more and more of these being developed as countries start to implement their commitments under the Paris Agreement. And so there are already out there a lot of lessons that can be learned when the other countries start to consider what form of carbon pricing works best for them at home. And it's also important to keep in mind that carbon taxes and emission trading systems are not two separate and incompatible instruments. Some countries implement just the carbon tax or just emission trading system. Some countries implement both in different sectors, for example, or in different parts of the economy. Some countries also cover the same sector, the same emissions with a carbon tax and with emission trading system that work in combination. And also in some cases, you have countries that start with a carbon tax, but then move to an emission trading system over time. So, for example, this is what Mexico is doing at the moment, and also what Colombia and Chile are thinking about. If you look at what's happening in the Latin American region, and obviously, then the next dimension to consider, and then I'll stop it here, is the international dimension for carbon pricing. And as we all know, we have market provisions under the Paris Agreement. This is what is often referred to as Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that can effectively create an international framework for carbon markets and for carbon pricing. And so going forward, it will also be interesting to see beyond the domestic implementation of carbon pricing, also what use countries will plan to make of market provisions, international market provisions under the Paris Agreement. And I'm happy to delve a bit more in on these topics in the discussion, of course.
We'll certainly jump into those, and I wanted to sort of take that as a hook and go back to Minister Levy. And we see many countries that have already implemented one or the other or both, and Brazil is still considering, still discussing it. And it feels a bit frustrating, as you, Minister, pointed out. Brazil has sort of a natural competitive advantage when we're talking about sustainability. It's a country with an incredibly clean energy matrix. We have biofuels. We were doing a very good job looking at deforestation. From a governmental point of view, why hasn't the implementation of a carbon market, why hasn't it happened yet? Why is it taking so long for it to be a reality in Brazil? What are the main challenges, and how can we as the private sector help?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think that Gustavo Pimentel gave a little bit of a sense of why is that. It's because of this dual aspect of our economy. The places where you have a lot of production of carbon, actually, it's hard to be traded, except because of, for instance, livestock and these kind of things. In addition, part of this is even illegal, so how you can trade things. In the industry, I think there is, first, there are taxes on fuel, although the tax on diesel has been reduced in recent years. But you have the industry as a whole. You could create a system of let's say, tax credits and costs. Basically, create some sort of carbon tax, and this would help in a few sectors. Although probably the cost of measuring emissions and so on, if you were to have either a carbon tax or a trade system where you have to measure the emissions of different companies, you have to see how you do that on an efficient way in a country like Brazil. We have one sort of, say, you could call either a trade system, which is the RenovaBio that has just started. And basically you put a cap, a trajectory for the emissions, aggregate emissions, and measured by how much fossil fuels the distribution companies sell, the gas companies sell, and they would have to offset this by buying some certificates from, say, producers of low carbon fuels. And this actually is done in a very broad way, because it's not only biofuel, other low carbon fuels would be eligible to produce these certificates that then could be sold directly. So it's a clever system where we don't have exactly a tax. You have a direct transfer from those who are producing low carbon fuels from those who are consuming. And exactly to address the issue that I mentioned before, which is the cost of implementation, this was concentrated on the big companies that sell gasoline and diesel, etc. Now, if you go beyond transportation, the other area you might have some taxation will be in heating for cooking, so domestic heating, which has a huge question in terms of how you tax. In the past, we had a system that might have facilitated the taxing, which was to give voucher for low-income people. So if you can differentiate the price of the commodity with the carbon tax from the affordability to low-income people by giving entitled people some sort of voucher that would be a subsidy for them to buy, we might be able to implement a carbon tax in this particular sector. So I think it's a bit, for those who understand the financial market in Brazil, it's a bit of the idiosyncrasy that we used to have in Brazil, where you had very little secondary trade in the fixed income market, just because most of our debt was, say, in floating rates. And you cannot make real money by trading LFTs or anything in the E, so you didn't get to the market. In part, this is still what you have in Brazil. It does not mean that if you come with some sort of a carbon tax, looking on how to make, say, basic staples affordable to low-income people, you could not have an improvement into the efficiency that we already have in the economy. And this would be particularly interesting in the case of road transportation, which accounts for a large part, a very large part of the energy consumption and by consequence of the emissions. So we already have 10% of diesel coming from soybean and other biofuels. And actually, these already respond to a very large proportion, about 20% of the production of soybean. And this year, where the global demand for soy is so big, actually had to reduce the proportion of biofuel in the field. But if we could find ways of addressing this without putting a too high cost on the transportation sector, because logistics in Brazil already accounts for a larger share of GDP than other countries. And usually this is an indicator of inefficiency, and you don't want to increase the inefficiency of the economy. You might get another big block of energy. Let me talk about another sector that could be very important and where Brazil has a tremendous advantage, which is steel making. Now, steel making is a big challenge in terms of emission, because it's not only the emissions from the energy production, but because transforming iron ore into iron and then in steel, this produces carbon because of the so-called reduction, which is how you take out the atoms of oxygen from iron ore. Iron ore is iron plus oxygen, and you have to take this out to get steel. Now, when you do this, usually the way to do this is to having a coal, okay? And this is a major source of emissions in the world. Now, in the case of Brazil, we can bypass that by using vegetable coal, charcoal. If this is produced in planted forests, it means that you can get this coal, absorbing the carbon, then you go for producing the iron pig, which is the first step to produce steel, where you have to take out the oxygen and producing CO2. But because you're using charcoal, which had first captured the CO2 in the trees, you actually get something that after the whole process is actually trapping carbon, sequestering carbon. So again, if you could have some sort of a pricing scheme, but this would have to be also in the global level, so that if you can have a zero carbon steel, because then you can complement after you get the iron pig, you can transform iron pig and steel by using electric furnace. And again, Brazil, our electricity is basically carbon free, and they expect to continue to be carbon free. So at the end of the process, you get something that nobody in the world has, which would be a steel that doesn't produce CO2. Now, if this is recognized and we can get some sort of price differential for this type of steel, this could create a huge market in Brazil. So I give this example. It's a particular example, although it's a very large, it's also a big emitter. I think 40 million tons of CO2 a year. Okay, it's not so little. Because if you can organize carbon credit and other mechanisms that could make this process more competitive. Today it's quite competitive, but still more expensive than the traditional process. We could actually address a major source of emissions around the globe with a technology that is basically ready. Of course, in 20 years, we may move to doing this reduction with the hydrogen, and we are working on that, but we have a solution that is right now. And I think the challenge of both those who design the architecture, the global architecture on carbon price, carbon credits, etc., as well as the financial market, is exactly to make this type of technology really viable and scalable. So in Brazil, we already have these, but in a relatively small scale and not throughout the full value chain. So from iron ore, from the forest, planted forest, to the final steel. But we already know how to do it. We already do, but in a much smaller scale than would be desirable. So that's the challenge, and the designing policies that will make these kind of things more feasible. And transportation and this green steel would be very transformational. And if you can really go into the global market for credits, all the Article 6, we could actually make even bigger contributions to address climate change using which things that ultimately are natural-based solutions and something that are overall mitigation increases. So it's a very solid approach.
Thank you, Minister. This is really interesting, and it seems that it's sort of between the carrot and the stick, right? So how can you encourage these big transformations, these sectors that are naturally big emitters? How do you incentivize them to change? And I wanted to sort of take a little bit on that and ask you, Stefano and Gustavo, a question of, I mean, the switching to a low carbon economy, switching to more sustainable practices is still seen as a burden, something that is expensive, that the government needs to come up with all the incentives because it's too difficult. And so how do you, as a government and Stefano internationally, how has this sort of mentality changed, or how is it changing? Because it's truly, you want to give incentives, but you also, and you reward the people who are doing good things, but you also need the stick sometimes to really push people to change. And Gustavo, I think the financial sector has a big role in this, in sort of pushing companies and its clients in, look, access to credit and investments are going to be more and more tied to what you're doing as a company. So it's really, you have the carrot and the stick, but what's the best method? Is it a combination to incentivize these sectors to fully change?
Yeah, thank you, Gabriella. Yeah, if I can pick up on this, and I like the example given by Joaquim for the steel sector, because it illustrates that the technical solution is there, and therefore the challenge you have is on the political space. So how do you actually manage to get this implemented? And what I see is that well, in different states, of course, you have interest groups putting pressure on policymakers on the direction of policy, and the challenge here is that, well, you as a policymaker, you can go all in. Let's say, let's put a carbon price across the board, and then we fine tune on how this price is established, be it the tax, be it on the cap, and you go all in. Like going all in, and perhaps Stefano can help me later on with some examples, is a very bold decision, and you need you need a lot of courage and political grip to do it. So in many places, what we actually see is that, let's try to do carbon pricing sector by sector, or let's pick different parts, and then let's do some testing. And then, of course, you have different interest groups saying, "Oh, please, not with my sector now, unless I am benefited by it," right? And this is, for instance, what we see at RenovaBio. RenovaBio is actually benefiting the biofuel sector, which is a sector that has actually been very damaged in the recent past by policy measures. So if we remember here, during the 2000s, the biofuel sector was heavily stimulated, and then there was a turnaround in policy that from 2009 or 2010, it was actually suffering quite a bit, and many biofuel producers were bankrupt. A lot of the biofuel producers are now just trying to survive, and then you come with RenovaBio, and the biofuel sector say, yes, let's do it, because they clearly benefit. Then let's talk about the steel sector. In the steel sector, the technical solution is there, but however, you have a sector that doesn't want another burden or doesn't want to have a change. And if we let put that into context, the steel sector has also suffered in recent years, not because of policy measures, but mostly because of global competition. There was a major increase in supply from China. So the Brazilian steel sector, if you look at the companies, they have not been performing quite well in the past years. So then imagine if you come now with a measure for the sector, you're going to say, no, please go to another sector. So I think the challenge we have as policymakers is to identify sectors or places where you can test the mechanism, and where there is a perception that most sectors or most stakeholders will benefit rather than being penalized. If I were a policy analyst, perhaps that's the suggestion I would make. But yeah, if you bring that to investors, of course, investors can put pressure, and the financial sector can put pressure on companies, but they cannot do it at the same scale from a policy measure. So there is so much that like the engagement and direct pressure can do to certain companies, and certainly the investors and financiers can stimulate innovators and stimulate some leading companies to try to push the boundaries. But if you really want things to scale, you need policy. Yeah? But perhaps Stefano can help me with this approach of going all in versus going specific.
Yeah, sure. And no, I think you both made great points, obviously. And I mean, it is a bold decision, and it is it can be a challenging decision for a policymaker to go out there and implement an ambitious carbon pricing policy. But I think at the same time, it all depends on how that is done and how the policy is designed. So first of all, I mean, obviously, when it gets to reduce CO2 emission, there's no single silver bullet or single policy that can be implemented and does everything. You of course need a combination of different policies and measures. But in general, carbon pricing, especially if it takes the form of an emission trading system, can really act as a policy that harmonizes and that brings consistency across different sectors. So if you look at how it works in most jurisdictions, it tends to cover mainly the power sector and the industrial and manufacturing sector, because of the reasons that Joaquim was describing. Obviously, if you cover those sectors that have large sources of emissions, you can capture a good chunk of your domestic emissions with a relatively low number of compliance entities and compliance actor, which makes everything a bit easier also from an administrative point of view. And by doing that, in most places where you cover energy and industry, you already have covered around 50% of your domestic emissions, which is a really significant percentage of what you need to achieve. And by having one single policy measure that covers different sectors, you can also avoid having a lot of fragmentation and a lot of patchwork of different measures that would put a different kind of burden on different sectors, and would also be open and subject to the gaming that Gustavo was describing between different sectors of saying, why am I supposed to do more if they're not doing anything, and so on and so forth. If you have one single carbon price across half of your economy, then everyone is subject to the same type of carbon price and has the same incentive of reducing emissions. And that is also what brings the economic efficiency of carbon pricing in, because then you really allow decarbonization and investments in emission reductions to take place where it's more economically efficient to do so. And it's also worth considering what it actually means to go all in when you implement a domestic carbon pricing policy. And again, there are different examples out there. There are some countries that started to experiment with specific sectors and then started to phase other sectors in over time, whereas in other cases, some countries already targeted the coverage, the sectoral coverage they wanted to have from the outset, and instead they phased in the policy measures little by little, not to create a shock at the beginning. So, the way it works in Europe and in a lot of other places is that they covered most of the sectors from the beginning. But then they had a sort of a slow start with a pilot phase and a learning by doing phase, and then the rules and the objectives and the targets were tightened over time as people got used to complying with the policy measure, and as people got to understand what it actually takes to be successful in participating in an ETS. And there's a lot of evidence out there of jurisdictions that had a carbon pricing policy or a carbon market for more than a decade now, and that were able to decouple economic growth from growth in emissions. And for example, Europe has been able to reduce steadily CO2 emissions while growing its economy. So you can actually achieve that.
Thank you, Stefano. And it really is such a tricky decision. And I think, as Joaquim mentioned and Gustavo mentioned, the political decision, sometimes it's truly the hardest part, or the hardest hurdle to overcome. And we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll start putting those to you guys. But the first one we have is from Laís Duarte, who's a reporter for Jornal da Cultura and Repórter Eco. And she essentially is asking how a green economy, a low carbon economy, could be the way for the economic strengthening or upwards movement after the pandemic. And I think that's a really interesting question, because again, if we look at green economy, there is a sense of it's too expensive. Right now, we should really not do big changes. We need to let things grow. We can't afford to lose jobs. And really the effort should be in making sure that the economy is growing again. But there's a very strong voice that says, actually, being more green and having mechanisms for low carbon economy can be a big engine in the recovery. So I think Minister Levy, Gustavo, and Stefano, in terms of internationally what you have been seeing, we'd love to hear your opinion on this.
Okay, that's a very good question. In the case of Brazil, the answer, I think, is easy. As I mentioned, Brazil has comparative advantages, and actually, the green economy in many cases is more competitive than alternatives. Today, the cheapest, energy sources to expand, for instance, the production of electricity is certainly solar and wind. And you have, in the case of wind, you have a very large potential. With onshore wind, we probably could double the production of electricity that you have now. If you factor in, say, offshore wind, which today is still a little bit experimental, but in 5 to 10 years, it will probably be as competitive as, say, onshore. We could double again. Okay. In the case of solar, basically, it's unbound for the needs that we have. It could actually replace some of the fossil fuels in, for instance, transportation. And in the case of Brazil, if you move to, say, electric car, they are really zero emissions, because in many countries it's good that you move because you have less pollution locally. But if you still having the energy coming from natural gas or from coal or whatever, the reduction is about, say, a third in emission from the pure, say, oil, traditional gas. So these things are the ones that I see as our advantage, and the way using them, okay, are the way to increase the productivity of the economy, and with these, actually unlocking new jobs, not only directly, because of course, when you build these things, even if some are capital intensive, you're creating jobs, and the wind power industry has created literally thousands of jobs and dozens of thousands of jobs in Brazil. But by increasing the productivity, by lowering the cost of energy, you create jobs in the rest of the economy. So, as I was saying, if you consider, for instance, solar, you can actually replace part of the consumption of the fossil fuels in the cars, with the big advantage that the efficiency of electric cars is much higher than the efficiency of internal combustion engines. So it means that actually, in terms of total energy, tera watt hour or barrels of oil equivalents, you can reduce by, I say, 60%, which means that if you compare the total energy consumption by the transportation sector today, and if you move to electricity, actually what you need is much less than what you consume from fossil fuels. And of course, in the case of some of the biofuels, if you can get the environment right, for instance, in the case of palm oil in the east of Pará, these are very degraded areas. So actually, you could again use the benefits of a palm oil to actually regenerate some of the forest that had been lost 30, 40, even 50 years ago. And you could produce something that would, for instance, help in the air transportation industry by doing biokerosene. And this creates also jobs, because it's not only planting the trees, and this is a particularly say labor-intensive kind of production, but also, of course, you have the refining, which creates jobs, and then you have the research that we can develop, because it's not trivial to come from say the palm oil to biokerosene that respond to all the needs. We know how to do. There are a few competing technologies. Well, we could have a Brazilian technology also, if we organize ourselves and in terms of guidance. So, as was mentioned, there is a political aspect to it. I think the real political aspect is to recognize all the possibilities that we can open by going this road, by recognizing our advantages, and without having to create a very cumbersome state structure or have very strict guidance or anything like this, but with a general view and some key, say, incentives, we could actually find a path that will put us in a very interesting, say, competing situation, competitive situation in for our exports that today are already low carbon, but could be even better. And of course, if you have a clear policy, it's also easier for other countries to recognize what you're doing, what our companies are doing, the quality of what they're doing, which would, of course, create, say, potentially create a price differential, increasing the revenue that you could get, the value of what you produce. So I think it's really a question of recognizing the opportunities, of organizing, giving the right, say, creating the right expectations for the private sector. And I'm sure that we could harvest a lot of good results and create a lot of jobs in all levels of skills in Brazil. And I'm not talking about 10 years, I'm talking starting now, as we leave the COVID, as we improve the quality of life of so many people and create new jobs, because we know that some jobs will be lost forever because of all the technological change, including what we're doing here. I didn't have to travel to Brussels or to New York to have this conversation. So that means a structural change in the economy. And a final thought, a lot of these things can help not only Brazil to get a better economy and new jobs, but also other countries. Through the mechanisms of trading of carbon, let's call it credit, but the Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, we can help countries going through their transitions. So they can be more ambitious in their own, say, contributions, but say, smoothing the shock in their own economies, at the same time that, for instance, by creating further scale and by helping to defray the cost of some new initiatives that are more efficient, that have a good economic ground, but sometimes don't get the finance, don't have the initial say scale to start. If you can trade and if you can help other countries to achieve their objectives, and let's be frank, the big challenge in terms of our global warming is the use of coal in many countries. So if you can help countries to be more ambitious, give them a little bit more of time to reduce their emissions at the same time that you build new sectors, that you be say long lasting because you be already in the new technologies. In Brazil, I think this is a classic case where international trade actually brings advantage for every partner and will have a meaningful, say, overall reduction of emissions in the foreseeable future. And you help to pave the way to our goals for 2030 and our goals of a zero carbon economy for 2050. I think Brazil has all the means to get very close to zero carbon economy, even before 2050, as we make this transition, especially with electrification of a number of activities, including transportation in the coming decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I will take advantage of a very good question that came in already posed to the group, and Gustavo and Stefano, perhaps you can take this one, obviously, Minister, if you want, jump in. But it's from Mario Torres, and he said, last week, the president of the European Central Bank hinted that central banks should review their bond portfolio and other operations with regards to climate change. Mrs. Lagarde called on central bankers to ask themselves if they were taking excessive risk by trusting markets to correctly price environmental issues. And his question is, so what would you suggest as a reduction of such excessive risk taken in Brazil? So I think, Gustavo and Stefano, is there a concern that markets will not correctly price? Is this something that really needs government intervention? How do you see this? And Gustavo, perhaps we start with you and then go to Stefano.
Sure. If we look the way this idea of pricing the climate is being discussed now, it's around the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which basically poses that you have physical risks of climate change to the economy, and they will. Most of the physical risks are not very short term. Of course, some scientists say it's already happening, but then you have the other type of risk, is the transition risk, which means whether policymakers, consumers, and different stakeholders will actually take the measures to transition to the low carbon economy, and therefore this will change the cost of capital of different sectors and economic activities, and therefore it could be posing a risk for investors. And that's the narrative which is being created, and it's becoming more accepted and becoming more embraced. And I think that the first effect that it has is actually on real assets rather than like buying sovereign debt from different states, which is what central banks mostly do with their reserves. So you see real assets in certain sectors becoming stranded or near stranded. Like it's very hard today to build a new coal-fired power plant in many jurisdictions. If you build one, then it's hard to sell. this month we had this interesting case about Engie, which is the European multinational that has a large subsidiary in Brazil, and they're trying to sell their very new coal-fired power plant in the south of Brazil, and they're looking for a buyer for the past 2 years. They cannot find it, and now they're trying to issue bonds, and the bond issuance is getting very difficult because pretty much nobody wants a coal asset anymore. So this is the first effect we're seeing from this transition risk. But of course, if you want to discuss systemic risk and something that central banks can actually do and steer financial markets to do, or even use its own reserves, then you start discussing assets which are not in the real sector anymore. So it's like sovereign bonds and currencies and such kind of instruments. Then you have a indirect effect that you have to see if this is really happening at the short term or not. There has been recently an interesting study. We at SITAWI we helped with the launch. It was from the Grantham Institute, Climate Change Institute at the London School of Economics, and it was about the climate change and the sovereign risk for Brazilian debt. And it was launched some months ago, and we're basically discussing this. This study is actually awarded Initiative of the Year by Environmental Finance magazine. It's a very interesting one. So it was pretty much saying that if a country, for example, like Brazil, doesn't take the measures to stop deforestation and reduce emissions from land use change and transition towards low carbon, then as an economy, it will start to have challenges in terms of trade, for instance, and even its fiscal pillar. And if both challenges happen, trade and fiscal, then you are deteriorating your credit quality, and therefore you're paying more for your debt. And that's something that, of course, as a country, you don't want to pay more. You want to pay less, and of course you want to keep your economy competitive. And I remember, Gabriella, you're discussing at your opening about trade. So, for instance, this everything which is happening in Brazil is likely delaying the EU-Mercosur agreement. So it's a missed opportunity for Brazilian exports if we don't do it right. So eventually this could have consequences on trade and on the fiscal side. Of course, Joaquim could elaborate much better than myself on this. But if you can take a look. It's a study by the Grantham Institute that mapped all of those risks and puts this question. The Brazilian Central Bank has indeed announced a sustainability agenda some weeks ago, and part of this agenda was to look at how they invest their reserves. So I think this follows some guidance from the European Central Bank that they should use their gunpowder to steer financial markets in the right direction. So I think it will eventually happen. So we just need to be aware of the different levels where this has an influence, either in the real economy or indirectly to sovereigns and their debt and their capacity to trade.
Yeah, and so if I can chime in real quick, I think this question is really interconnected with the previous one as well. And again, Joaquim and Gustavo made some excellent points. So I'll try to be quick and concise. I mean, if you look at what's happening globally, I mean, countries in general are undertaking two really important things right now. The first one is, of course, designing a recovery package for the post-COVID situation, understanding, what it will take them to bring and to recover their economies to pre-COVID levels. And they're also thinking about what commitments they will have to put forward at the next climate conference, which will take place in December of next year in Glasgow. and countries under the Paris Agreement are expected to bring to the table their new and revised goals for 2030. And of course, I mean, those two processes, so the climate goals for 2030 and the post-COVID recovery packages, are deeply interconnected, or at least they should be, just because it's I mean, it's an excellent opportunity to align and harmonize the two things instead of having two different packages that go in opposite directions. And so it's really, really important that post-COVID recovery packages are aligned with what will be the next climate goals. And this links to the second question, which is how do we do that? And I think Gustavo outlined quite clearly what the challenges are and what the difficulties could be in terms of visibility. And this is also an area where explicit carbon pricing, such as carbon taxes and emission trading systems, can bring some more clarity to the picture, because at least they help understanding what the actual carbon price is across different sectors. And of course, the picture they give, it's only partial, because it they give a picture of what the current price is, and it doesn't really tell you what the price will be 10 years from now, or over the full lifetime of the investments you're making. But it's a starting point, and that combined with the long-term goal that either your emission trading system has or that your Paris commitment has, can give you some visibility over what the expected carbon price can be, and that will determine which investments make sense, because they contribute to the goals, and they contribute to financing sectors that will support sectors and production practices that will support achieving your goals, and which other investments might not make sense because they could go to practices that will be outdated a few years from now because they're not aligned with your environmental objectives.
Can I make two very short comments on this very good intervention? First one, as Gustavo mentioned, the Brazilian Central Bank has actually unveiled a quite, ambitious green agenda. And among the different things that they're doing, supporting green bonds and reviewing their portfolio, which of course in the case of Brazil is different from Europe, because the central bank doesn't buy private bonds, at least so far. But one thing that's very important that they're doing is how you put the climate risk as one of the metrics of the financial market risk. And by doing that and start to ask questions to banks, actually you create an impulse in the whole economy, because when the central bank asks, okay, what are your exposures in terms of loans or whatever for a bank, the bank has to go to the companies and really understand with that and price accordingly. Because already the central bank in Brazil sometimes would put additional charge in some loans in terms of capital requirement, depending on the climate or environmental exposure. So I think this cannot replace the work of government, of taxes, but it's a very important contribution. The other thing is there was comment about the programs in Europe, and maybe you're going to see programs like this in the US, and actually these open opportunities for Brazil. One opportunity that I think I mentioned is hydrogen. So Germany and the EU are putting a big effort in increasing the use of hydrogen, even to replace part of their natural gas for a number of reasons. Okay, we can produce hydrogen, and by transforming in ammonia or methanol, there are many ways of transporting hydrogen. So actually you could create an ecosystem like today you have for fossil fuel trade, you could have a similar ecosystem of trading and transportation of, say, vectors that you carry this hydrogen. Ammonia and methanol are examples of that are easier to transport than hydrogen. And this could become a global market where you're going to produce energy, where it's cheapest to produce, where you have good insulation, where you have, say, territory like here, like Chile, like some places in Africa. And countries you have, of course, energy security because there will be many suppliers, and this would create new income streams also for poor countries. So it's a kind of thing that if we align with what is happening in already in some countries, in some jurisdictions, and also try to move that in a way that creates new trade opportunities, can have a huge impact, not only in terms of climate change, reducing emissions, but also creating new income streams for countries of all levels.
Yeah, if I can pick up, Joaquim gave a very important example of how central banks, through the risk management function, can stimulate. And perhaps we should bring the opportunity side as well. And sometimes the opportunity side things, they do not need short-term carbon prices. So if I look at the financial sector, like the banks, the Brazilian banks should be the ultimate lovers of electrifying the car fleet. If you think about an electric car, it's basically a car that costs 3 times more when you acquire it, but then your cost of maintenance and the cost of fuel goes near zero. So that means that you a 70,000 reais car that many consumers would likely buy without credit, now it's equivalent electric, it's probably 200,000 reais, it's 3 times more. So very likely they will need to finance part of it. So that means the auto loan books of banks could potentially triple without any incentives, right? And of course, it's a market that, well, the banks understand the risk. The client is not paying, you can get the asset back and so on. So let's go to the property market, to mortgages. And the opportunity here is that if you can have solar power in every new development, or even retrofitting existing apartments that you're doing mortgage for, why not embedding the cost of the solar energy within the overall mortgage package, and then you actually have a green mortgage. And that also means for a bank that you increase the amount financed, because of course the systems need some upfront capex, and you're actually also increasing the value of the property. So if in any event of default the bank needs to reclaim and foreclosure on that, listen, this is a solar powered home. I mean, it should sell easily or higher as well. We already have some examples of this, not in Brazil, but if you look at Fannie Mae is the US-based mortgage provider. It is the world's largest green bond issuer because it has a huge green mortgage book, which is pretty much about giving better conditions for their customers to do efficient heating and solar energy in the properties. And that's actually creating an opportunity both on the loan book, but also on financing on its liabilities through green bond issuance. So I think it's an opportunity that the Brazilian financial sector is yet to capture, but it's still there and doesn't need any incentives.
Thank you, Minister Levy, Gustavo, and Stefano. And I think, Gustavo, your last point of buying the cars and bringing solar heating to houses, I think it also brings in the role that consumers have, because I think we keep talking about big industries, et cetera, and obviously that's where a lot of the big impact comes from. And I think we need to take into account what we as consumers can do, because it also brings the issue closer. I think a lot of the resistance or the delay into embracing sort of sustainability is because people still feel it's such an issue, a topic that is removed from their day-to-day lives, and it's not. And actually, there's a very interesting question in that sense, if we can change tracks a little bit, from Patricia Dresch. And she says the reduction of green gas emissions depends on reduction of inequalities, mainly social inequality. How to deal with this? And she adds, we can produce the best renewable fuel, but if inequality isn't solved, it will not actually work in terms of reducing emissions. So it's a bit of a different question, but perhaps Stefano will start with you, and then Gustavo, and then Minister Levy.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to say a few words and a few considerations about it, knowing that it's an excellent question, and to some extent it is something that no one has a full answer to. But I think it's really important to reflect on this, and the main challenges that the space of climate change policies, and especially carbon pricing, has are around the communication of it, to some extent the public acceptance of it, and also, as it was touched on earlier in the discussion, also the politicization and polarization of the issue. And all these are things that impact the implementation of carbon pricing and climate change policy in general in a negative way. And these are issues that are, of course, really, really hard to unpack, but they have a deep impact. So, for example, we can think about what happened in countries like France or Chile in terms of the protests that were generated as a consequence of a small increase in a fuel cost or in a consumer tax. Or we can think about the countless examples where countries adopted carbon pricing policies, then a new administration came in and repealed everything and dismantled the whole system. Or even if we think about how polarized the climate change issue is in a lot of countries, I mean, we just have to think about in which terms this is discussed in the US election context, for example, and I don't think you could have a more polarized debate than that one, and it's really hard to understand how to overcome these challenges. I think to some extent the government has a lot of tools and a lot of power that it can deploy to increase the acceptability and support for climate change policies. I think there's a huge work that has to be done around clearly communicating why some policies are implemented, why they are doing that, and how that is being done. And of course, I mean, there are a lot of different measures that governments can take to ease the impact on consumers and to ease the impact on the most exposed social parts of the population to an increase in cost, for example. And also, governments have tools to handle the just transition that needs to happen to relocate resources and workers from one sector to another as the economy decarbonizes. And there are experiences on how that worked in some countries and in some contexts. There are also a lot of experiences on how that went wrong. But I think it's an area where we will need to do an increased amount of work in the coming years, because it's it's a key part of this discussion, and to some extent, it is a part of this discussion that has been a little bit overlooked, I think, in the last few years, as people mainly focused on the design of climate change policies rather than also trying to address these other aspects and implications.
Gustavo?
I'll be very short. I was wondering if Stefano would mention the expression "just transition," and so he did. And why I'm mentioning this, because historically we've been in developing or emerging economies, we use the expression sustainable development, because the idea behind it is that we still need to develop and grow and solve our and lift people from poverty, and that requires increasing incomes and so on. But we have to do this sustainably with the new technologies, low carbon, etc., and not the way most developed countries did this decades ago. And sometimes when we stop hearing and debating on the international space, sustainable development seems to be faded. And then we always hear about just transition, because that's what developed economies need to do. They need to transition, and they should leave no one behind, right? Which was what Stefano was mentioning here. So that perhaps my only point here is that let's go back to the basic concepts, I think, which are here since the 1980s. It's sustainable development. It's solving our inequalities and lifting people from poverty. But in a sustainable way for the environment, so that we still fit within our planetary boundaries. But I'll pass to Joaquim so he could possibly have an even better answer than this.
No, these are great answers. I make two comments. First, like I mentioned in the case, for instance, of cooking gas, liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, that if you want to put a carbon price on it, and it's still today is much cheaper than electricity. I mean, to cook with electricity, in particular in Brazil, is more expensive when you factor in the cost of the equipment and even the rates. Okay, if you want to put a carbon price, then you have to come up with some sort of voucher or subsidies to low-income families, so that they can purchase at, say, market plus tax price, but they have this additional income, so their welfare is preserved. So this has application to a number of other areas where you may have to change the relationship. Think about gas, say transportation, urban transportation, and so on. You have to come up in a way where you stimulate the transition, but you don't hurt the low-income people. You also have to think ways, and that goes well beyond just say climate change, of course making the whole economy more inclusive. And in some cases, especially when you're talking about transitions, the financial sector can have a very important role with a little bit of help of government. Why is that? As it was mentioned, there are new technologies that are more efficient than the old ones, which means that if you move to the new technology, you're going to have a gain. And then the question about this just transition is, how do we split this gain? It goes all to the consumer. Suppose you had a coal plant and you move to the electricity. And actually, with the new solar electricity, the price of electricity will be cheaper than the price of electricity from coal. But then there were a lot of people, not only the investors, but also the workers that were related to this coal plant. Now, if you move immediately to a lower price, because you now have a technology that is more efficient and the whole gain goes to the consumer, it's good. But then you have not taken care of the people that are linked to the old technology. And this, of course, creates a sort of a political blockage. But it can be addressed if there are means that we split this gain. And part of this can do by finance, because if, for instance, the regulator reduces the price of electricity, but not fully, so that you leave some part of the gain to be continue to be transferred to the old, say, technology owners and stakeholders. You can create bonds and other mechanisms that can anticipate that and compensate people. So I think that all these transitions actually can be helped by a clever and actually well thought combination of efforts from our regulators and the financial market. There are many things that can be done in this way that actually improves the welfare of people, low-income people, and decreases the dislocation that some of these transitions would create.
All right, we're at time. Is it okay to ask a couple more questions? We have so many coming in. I think we have over close to 200 people watching, and certainly 5 minutes. Okay. I will ask one last question that it in part, I think for Minister Levy and Gustavo and Stefano, perhaps you can take the more technical aspect, but it's from Shigeo Watanabe, and he's asking, the EU is discussing a border tax associated with the carbon footprint of their imports. This would boost Brazilian low-emission steel. Do you think this will be adopted in the EU and in the rest of the world? How does a border tax affect the ETS and the fungibility of allowances and emission reduction credits? So that's the technical part of the question. But I think for Minister Levy and Gustavo, perhaps going back to the broader trade question. And sometimes it feels, for example, that this is the EU punishing and putting restrictions, but the truth is that Brazil should be making the same requirements on their imports. And Brazil should be helping sustainability become a better part of trade negotiations. So how do you see Brazil's role in this, Minister Levy? And I think with that, we can wrap up.
Okay. All these things depend on the rules, negotiations. As I was mentioning, of course, for most of our industry, we would have a very small carbon footprint. So actually it would improve the competitiveness, like I say, from our steel, from a lot of our products, even those done in a traditional way, for instance, because some of our plants are newer, the quality of our iron ore is better actually by ton of steel. Even in the traditional way, we are more competitive. And then, of course, if they would have a real, say, tax in the case of steel, actually this could give a boost, for instance, for the green steel that I mentioned. So we have to see the details. We have to, the most important thing when you have such a tool is a transparency. What is really the objective and how are you implementing? And this, I think, has to be negotiated so people will find that it's fair. And we want, of course, to have a fair, free trade.
And so just building quickly on that, so carbon border adjustments are one of the most popular topics in Europe at the moment. They seem to be really at the top of everyone's agenda. And I think it's interesting to consider what that means and what the implications are. I mean, as Joaquim pointed out, a lot of a lot of considerations will actually lie in the details. There are about 1,000 different ways in which you can design and implement a carbon border adjustment. depending on the purpose and on the intentions you have. So it will be interesting to see how the EU actually proposes to implement it. At the end of the day, it is a measure to protect competitiveness, and there are competitiveness implications as a result of the adoption of a carbon pricing policy when there is a differential between the domestic price and the price that competitors pay elsewhere. And there are two ways of solving that. Either you level down the price for your domestic industry by giving exemptions, or you level the price up for competitors by a border carbon adjustment, for example, or the inclusion of importers under your policy. But in general, I think the carbon border adjustment proposal in Europe can also be seen as basically as a push and as a stick to drive other countries to do more, not to run into the application of a border carbon adjustment. And that is also the idea behind hopefully how things will play out under the Paris Agreement. So obviously competitiveness concerns will be reduced once more and more jurisdictions implement carbon pricing and implement domestic measures. So if by proposing the introduction of a border carbon adjustment, the consequence is that other countries will be more inclined to do more and to price carbon domestically, that's possibly a more positive and constructive way out, because then you don't need the implementation of a carbon border adjustment, because competitors will be on a more equal level playing field, and you will have a more homogeneous application of a carbon price internationally, which is effectively the ideal situation for industries that compete at the international level.
Great, and I think we're at time. Gustavo, do you have any last words? No? Minister Levy, Stefano, Gustavo, thank you so much. I think we could have had 3 more hours of discussions. We certainly had questions for that. I want to thank you all for your great inputs and for your time, and hopefully we can really move this issue forward in Brazil. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for the invitation.
It's a pleasure, and good to hear Gustavo and Stefano.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all who participate and listen to it too.
Pode ser. Gabriela, pode sair.
Posso sair, gente?
Oi, Gabriela, correu tudo bem. Pode sair, sim.
Beleza.
Tá. Tudo certo.
Muito obrigada, hein?
Foi muito bom, bacana, né? Foi legal, né? Achei que rendeu bastante. E tinha um monte mais de pergunta, meu Deus do céu.
Parabéns.